Welcome to GMD 145, Type and Typography. I'm your professor for this course, Shannon Duronio Chavez. And this is Lecture 1, What is Typography? Each lecture begins with a summary slide covering a glossary of terms, notable people, technology, artifacts, and closes with a highlight of a designer whose work is important to the history of type and typography in the field of graphic design, a section I like to call Monsters of Type. So let's jump into it. What is typography? Typography is the art and technique of arranging type to make written language legible, readable, and appealing when displayed. Typography is the principal element that sets design apart from disciplines such as painting, illustration, and photography. It's the expressive use of letter forms as a representation of the human voice of written or spoken language. Arguably, without type, it's not graphic design. So here are some examples included on the slide. A photograph by David LaChapelle. Notice no letter forms, not graphic design. It's a photograph. To the right of that, we see an illustration created by Luis Pinto. Again, no typography, no graphic design. This is an illustration. Third, all typography, definitely graphic design. A poster designed by Craig Ward that says bad typography is everywhere in bold red letter form, easy to read, easy to see. And then hidden very subtly behind that is good typography is invisible. And this poster illustrates a principle about the appropriateness of typography and the quality that typography brings to graphic design. So typography is a performance. It doesn't just sit on a page, it speaks. The way it's designed and arranged becomes a visual embodiment of the voice, shaping how words are felt as much as how they're read. The performance of typography expressed through its form, rhythm, and placement has the power to evoke emotion, construct meaning, and determine the depth of engagement for the audience. So some images we see here that demonstrate how a typeface works like a voice and changes the way that we interpret something. We have some famous logos rendered with Comic Sans. Kodak, NASA, Chanel, Disney, McDonald's. Does Chanel feel fancy? Does Chanel feel luxurious when we've rendered it with Comic Sans? Maybe not as much. Underneath that, we see the Google logo before and after its 2015 rebrand. To the left, the original Google logo is rendered with a serif typeface. That's these little, extending lines at the top and bottom of letter forms. The lines are also thick and thin. This is a type style that calls back to the early days of print. Serif typefaces are print-based typefaces, which is why it made sense that in 2015, Google, a company that lives on the internet, which is broadcasted through display screens that are basically grids, to use a sans serif geometric mono-weight typeface that makes better use of a grid display than a serif typeface does. Throughout the lecture, you will find that slides contain links that take you to videos and research rabbit holes that you can engage with on your own. The elements and principles of typography. Designers use a range of typographic elements and principles to achieve specific visual, functional, and emotional outcomes in their compositions. For example, hierarchical choices can guide how content is read, understood, and directs the reader's attention to what is most important. While choices made in lettering and kerning, which shape space around letter forms, can directly affect legibility and the ease and speed of reading. To the right, we have a snapshot taken from MIT's brand guidelines, where you can very clearly see a hierarchical shift between header, which is up here, and body copy, which is down here. We can also see decisions made about spacing between lines and spacing throughout reading lines that affect legibility, how quickly and easily we can move through the text, and then how much of that information we'll actually retain based on the ease of reading. To learn more about these fundamentals, you can click here. All right, now let's start taking a look at the origin of writing systems. Cuneiform is one of the earliest writing systems, distinguished by wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets using a blunt reed stylus. The word cuneiform comes from the Latin cunis, which means wedge, and forma, which means shape. Developed by the Sumerians in the late 4th millennium BCE, cuneiform began as a system of pictographs, little images, eventually evolved into ideographs, which is an image that represents an idea, which allowed for more complex communication. So, unlike later alphabets, cuneiform was not directly tied to spoken language. It was a symbolic written system, was not connected to the human voice. The development of this written language gave Sumeria a powerful advantage by enabling their ability to record, preserve, and organize knowledge in a way that was no longer purely oral, and in a way that oral traditions could not match. The Phoenician alphabet is the oldest verified consonantal, I always have trouble with that word, alphabet. It is one of the earliest writing systems to actually represent spoken language, the human voice, the sound we make. Each character corresponds to a specific spoken sound, which layers the groundwork for phonetic writing. The word phonics comes from this root. So you may remember in kindergarten, your teacher talking about phonemic awareness, learning not just the name of the letter form, but the sound that it makes. That word phonemic and phonics comes back to the Phoenician alphabet. It was developed around 1050 BCE, and the Phoenician script gradually spread through trade and cultural exchange. The Greek alphabet has been used to write the Greek language since the 8th century BCE. It is derived from Phoenician script, and it was the first alphabet to introduce distinct letters or vowels as well as consonants. The revolutionary step that allowed for more precise representation to spoken language. So you'll notice the difference between Phoenician alphabet and Greek alphabet is the introduction of vowels. This is an incomplete version of our current alphabet. The Greek alphabet gets us closer. This innovation made the Greek alphabet an ancestor of many later writing systems, including Latin, Cyrillic, and shaping the linguistic landscape of both Europe and parts of Southwest Asia, North Africa. Beyond its role in language, the Greek alphabet endures today as a source of symbols and labels in mathematics, science, and other scholarly fields, bridging the ancient and the modern worlds. Finally, we land at the Roman alphabet. The Roman alphabet is the foundation of the International Phonetic Alphabet, which corresponds to the modern English alphabet. It serves as the official script for most Western European languages and has become one of the most globally dominant writing systems through centuries of cultural expansion and colonization. So here's a good example. The Nahuatl language and adaptation. Before European contact, the Mexica or Aztec people had their own rich writing and language system, Nahuatl. It was composed of logograms, pictographic elements, ideograms, but through colonization, the Nahuatl-speaking people adopted the Roman alphabet and used its forms to translate and preserve their language. So they were able to translate the sounds that they make when speaking Nahuatl. So words like coyote, chocolate, those are all Nahuatl words, were able to be translated into Roman letter form. And this gave them the ability to capture their histories and perspectives after colonizers had smashed, burned, and destroyed their libraries and records. So, this practice is common across colonial projects worldwide, which illustrates how writing systems become both tools of control and can also become tools of resilience. Let's begin talking about decorative typography. We're going to start with illuminated manuscripts, which are texts that were transcribed and illustrated by hand. This is not a printed object. They're often embellished with real gold, silver, and pigment that was made from precious minerals. The earliest surviving substantive illuminated manuscripts date from AD 400 to 600 and were produced in Italy and the Eastern Roman Empire. So, a note about the creators of these books. Historically, these books were attributed to the work of monks who transcribed biblical writing, books of hours, prayers, using a series of tools, bound paper, as was mentioned earlier, gold, silver, and precious minerals. However, the excavating of a graveyard at a German nunnery found that the skulls of people interred in that graveyard, which were female, had evidence of transcribing illuminated manuscripts embedded in their teeth. As these books were transcribed, the tools, the brushes, the stylus that was used, the transcriber would often lick the end of their stylus and place it into the pigment or the metal or the minerals, therefore transferring those pigments into their teeth. So we can actually look at the skulls and look at the teeth and determine who created these. So they were created by both men and women. Their significance lies not only in their artistic and historical value, but also in their role in maintaining a link to literacy alongside non-illuminated texts. So, had it not been for the monastic scribes of late antiquity, much of the literature of Greece and Rome would have perished in Europe. Why? The patterns of text survival are shaped by what was deemed useful or appropriate to a small, literate Christian elite. So these are created during a time period where literacy is not as important to a person's everyday activities, right? We're looking at feudal societies, agrarian economies. The people who are the most illiterate are the most elite. The most wealthy have the most privilege, the most leisure, and the most money. Even wealthy land barons and nobles who were illiterate still collected illuminated manuscripts because they were lecture objects. They were a flex. They were valued for their beauty and their status as much as their content. So, because of their beauty, because of their status, a legacy of written history and language survived through a period of extremely low literacy rates in Europe. We're going to move on to mechanized type. So, movable type is a system of printing and typography that uses movable components, usually individual letters and punctuation, to reproduce elements of a document. The world's first known movable type system was created by a man named Bi Sheng in China around 1040 AD. So, to the top right, what you see here is a movable type printing block with a printed page from China around the 11th century, similar to the invention of Bi Sheng. And so these are ceramic stamps that fit into a block matrix. They would be inked up, paper would be placed over, you would rub the back of the paper to transfer to the ink, and now you had a printed page. So, what is the difference between this and this? Typically, the creation of illuminated manuscripts could take one scribe their entire life to reproduce. So this is also what made them very precious. The slow production of illuminated manuscripts versus speeding up the production of a book by being able to recreate many pages in a single day, as opposed to only being able to recreate one page in a single day. In Europe, Johannes Gutenberg developed a mechanized metal movable type system around 1450, which introduced key innovations in casting type using a matrix and a hand mold. Gutenberg was the first to create typepieces from an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. The same combination is still used in type casting today. So what you see to the bottom on the left is metal type similar to that developed by Johannes Gutenberg. You may notice if you take a look at this image long enough that something is a little funny. Yes, these letters are backwards. Imagine, in order to print a text that reads correctly from left to right, every letter has to be set backwards from right to left. And you would have to do this by hand, right? You would pull these little metal letter forms, you would place them onto a little line, a sheet of lead, which is where we get the word leading. So there's these little strips of lead that fall in between each line. And you would have to place those letters backwards, right? From right to left instead of left to right. And this is what was done for letterpress printing. So this is a technique of relief printing that uses a printing press. A worker composes and locks movable type into a bed of the press, inks it, and then the press presses paper over it. And this transfers the ink from the raised type onto paper, which creates an impression both visually and tactilely. So this example of letterpress, these are not Renaissance era letter forms. You will learn about these. These are um, industrial era wood type large letter forms to create posters and broadsides. These typefaces connect back to early eras of advertising, billboard making, and this beautiful example that we see here, Abre Libros, Abre Fronteras, is a poster designed by Amos Paul Kennedy Jr., who is a contemporary letterpress design artist. And here's a picture of Amos Paul. I love his poster says send money. This is not a lucrative business, but it is a satisfying and fun one. Linotype was developed after the Gutenberg press and metal type in the industrial era. So the linotype machine is a line casting machine used in printing alongside letterpress printing. So linotype was used as the industry standard for magazines, posters from the late 19th century, right, industrial era, all the way to the 60s and 70s, when it was largely replaced by offset lithography, which is a photographic process, and computer typesetting. So this is a technology that survived for almost 100 years and then was replaced by computers. You can click on this link to watch a demonstration of a linotype machine. I'll give you a brief explanation looking at this guy. So we talked about Gutenberg's press and his metal matrix of type using this alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. Here, the linotype machine um, has a molten pot of that alloy. And as the typesetter types out letter forms, a negative mold of that letter form drops down into the line. And once a single line of type has been typed out, you would pull lever and hot lead would pour into that mold. And when it cooled, you could pull that cast, that line cast out, take it to a press bed, add it to your block, and begin printing with it. So what this did was it sped up the job of having to pick out each tiny letter form from a wooden drawer against a wall. Once something was finished being printed, you could just throw all of that type back into the molten pot and cast a new set of letter forms. So this helped save on space, right? It reduced the need to have as many wooden cases full of little type letter forms because you would be making those letter forms your own on the fly. Photo typesetting comes along in the 60s and 70s. Typesetters use a machine called a photo typesetter, which projects light through a film negative of an individual character within a font. The light passes through the lens and it could magnify to reduce or make larger the character size before exposing it onto photographic paper, which was collected on a spool inside a light tight canister and then was developed and it would spit it out. So sort of think about a photo booth, getting your picture taken in a photo booth. So this produced photos, clear film of letter form. That exposed photographic paper was then fed into a processor, which pulled it through 2 or 3 chemical baths and developed that type image. The finished strip was used to create something called paste up or a film makeup. And the next steps in the pre-digital layout process. So this is the paste up era. What we see here is a graphic designer doing his job. He is exactly what it sounds like, cut and paste, collaging together a mechanical or a page that would then be photographed and then used in the lithographic process to print. This little guy here is a little example of paste up, what a mechanical or mock-up might look like, defining headers, defining space between things, a bit of a style guide. Um, and if you click here, you can watch a preview for the Graphic Means documentary, produced and directed by graphic designer and archivist Briar Levitt. I highly recommend watching the full documentary. It will humble you, and you will have so much appreciation for the digital tools that we have access to today. Which brings us to digital typesetting. In 1985, desktop publishing became widely available, beginning with the Apple Macintosh Aldus PageMaker, later Quark Express, and a technology called PostScript. So improvements in software and hardware, along with rapidly falling costs, popularized desktop publishing and made it possible to achieve high quality typographic control far more affordably than with earlier mini computer based systems and non-computer based systems. So imagine the computer that sits in front of you, that laptop that you have, has replaced this entire thing, right? This helped reduce some space on storage of metal type, takes an entire warehouse and shoves it into an electronic box. That is a huge, huge development in the history of graphic design. So by the year 2000, the typesetting industry had contracted significantly following the desktop publishing revolution of 1985. So publishers increasingly adopted digital tools and integrated typesetting into design in-house. So this is something that would happen out of house. A bunch of people sitting around taping, pasting things up, following the instruction of a client who had asked for a specific typeface, specific sizes, right? They're following this sort of style guide to paste this down. But this process moves from maybe a typesetting bureau or agency into in-house processes. So now you have a typesetter who is working at a computer in a desk in-house alongside the rest of the design team. Um, so moving things in-house reduced reliance on specialized shop, and then eventually maintaining high typographic standards and technical expertise internally proved costly, right? So they're always looking to save some money, always looking to cut some corners. So what contracted from an outside service of typesetting and then moved inside and became typesetters working alongside the rest of the graphic design team eventually led to organizations outsourcing this work to freelance designers and specialists who could afford to have this technology at home or in their own office. So you'll see this cycle with technology and with economy of the roles of design moving in and out of house, right? Which is why we have such a robust agency, in-house sort of model, and a freelancer, solopreneur, or boutique agency model. Both still survive, but both were made possible by digital typesetting, desktop publishing. This is an example of early desktop publishing software. This is an interface from Adobe PageMaker, which predated InDesign. And finally, we arrive at our monsters of type. This is Susan Kare. Susan Kare designed the first font used on a Macintosh computer in 1984, a bitmap font called Chicago. Chicago played a crucial role in shaping Apple's brand identity and remained a key element of the Mac operating system up until its user interface was redesigned in 1997. She also designed the first set of user interface icons. She's the queen of the early emoji, um, which included a smiling Apple computer. So when we talk about bitmap typefaces, we're talking about a typeface designed on a really low density resolution grid. And you can see examples of her typeface here on the early click wheel iPod. This thing did not connect to the internet, did not have a color screen. And this is the work of Susan Kare. That is her typeface. Um, her original emojis her original emojis icons were drafted on graph paper using pen and ink. and then submitted to be digitized. And she did this work in exchange for having a free computer, a free Apple computer. What happens during this time that I think is really important and notable is the old guard of designers who are used to doing this, who are used to working like this, refused to move to this model. So much so as guilds drafting letters rejecting the computer, swearing that they would never use them. But then you had these really like younger, brave, and excited about technology designers like Susan Kerr who embraced the technology. And what happened was the old guard sort of disappeared. Whole jobs lost overnight because either their job was now rendered unnecessary by technology or they refused to adopt new technology. I hope you enjoyed Type and Typography Lecture 1. I'm excited to keep working with you. We'll see you in Lecture 2.